My experience occurred more than 2 decades ago in June 1988, but the details remain as if no time has passed. My identical twin sister and I were 2 months premature and suffered from severe asthma as a result. I was taking asthma medication when it became toxic in my system at the age of 19. Doctors were unable to determine the cause, but toxicity is the source of my NDE. This is my story. It was an unusually hot June day in Minnesota, and I'd spent some time outside before meeting a friend for lunch. When I began to feel ill, we went to a restaurant and ordered our meals. I developed a fever, my hands began to tremble, and I became nauseated. Our food arrived, but my symptoms worsened to the point where I couldn't eat. I asked a friend to drive me home, and on the way, we had to stop because I needed to vomit. I thought it might be related because I had been out in the sun. When we arrived at my house, my mother immediately called the hospital emergency room for assistance. They treated it as a heat stroke and told my mother to take me for a cool bath, which seemed to help. I went to my room to sleep because I was exhausted. What happened next is difficult to describe. I felt as if I were in another era. I felt incredibly peaceful and surrounded by an essence that transcended love in human form. Then there was chaos as I was taken to the hospital by ambulance. Later, I found out that a gurgling sound coming from me woke up my twin sister because we shared a room. I was experiencing a seizure. My back was arched, my head was drawn back, rigid, and mucus was coming out the sides of my mouth as I gasped for air. I then appeared to choke on mucus, stop breathing, and turn bluish gray. My sister had the foresight to perform the Heimlich maneuver to dislodge the mucus. I inhaled deeply and continued seizing after dislodging the mucus. My sister yelled to my mother, who dialed 911, and I was whisked away to the hospital. I don't remember much of the seizing, only the next stage of events. The seizures were apparently difficult to control. My heart rate and blood pressure were both dangerously high, resulting in cardiac arrest. I returned to the timeless, love-filled void. My heart was shocked, and a pulse was obtained, but my blood pressure and heart rates dropped to dangerously low levels. I was in a coma for 3.5 days. I was in the cardiac intensive care unit at the time, and I recall leaving my body. I felt like a buoyant, light ball of energy. I was standing in the corner of my room, looking down on my body diagonally. I remember thinking how strange my body appeared, lying there, hooked up to all of the machines. It didn't look like me at all. My supervisor, I worked at the hospital where I was being treated, came in to see me at one point. When she saw my lifeless body, she gasped and covered her mouth. I wanted to console her, but she couldn't hear me and fled the room. I'm not sure what happened after that. I recall being in what I can only describe as a timeless, expansive void. It was as if I were hanging out there. It was incredibly peaceful, and even though I didn't see a light, I felt a powerful, amazing sense of peace and love. As I type, that image or sensation comes to life. I didn't want to leave, but I also knew that I couldn't stay. I had lost track of time. Later, I discovered that my sister had placed her head on my chest on that final day of my coma. She told me that she had a vision of me in full hospital garb and equipment with a bright light behind me. I apparently said, "Don't worry, everything will be fine. I have a lot to say to you." I don't recall speaking with her, but I'm looking into hypnosis to see if I can recall more of my experience. At that point, she jumped up and ran to tell my family that I was fine. I awoke from my coma shortly after. Getting up. I was medically paralyzed due to all of the IVs and various lines going into me, and my hands were restrained at the wrist to prevent me from pulling out the equipment or central lines. "Mary Jo, if you can hear and understand me, squeeze my hand." I recall hearing this as the echo in my head, meaningless words bouncing around in my head. My chest was rising and falling on its own. I was on a breathing machine. I couldn't move my body, but I managed to squeeze the hand as instructed. When I opened my eyes, I saw a woman crying. I eventually realized it was my mother, but it took a few hours for me to recognize her. I was completely perplexed. I was surrounded by balloons and cards. The colors, sounds, and smells, as well as the emotions of those around me, were overwhelming. I had no idea what had happened, and my body was in excruciating pain. It was strange. After a few weeks of speech, physical, and occupational therapy, I was released. I walked out with no heart damage. Although I was aphasiac, the seizure did not result in permanent brain damage. I made a complete recovery. The medication's toxicity was lethal, sending enzyme levels sky high, and while my muscles were sore, there was no permanent damage to them. My doctor later told me that there was nothing they could have done to save me, that something intervened and my survival was a miracle. She stated that it was because of this that I had a purpose in this life. I returned home feeling lonely, angry, confused, and unsure of my mission or what had occurred. Nonetheless, I went on to study speech pathology, which led to my current position as a sign language interpreter. I had a strong desire to serve and assist others in healing as I had. Because there was no follow-up, I mostly kept my experience to myself. It would take me 2 decades to finally tell my story. The sense of peace and love has always remained with me, but because I was so open, I suffered from depression and anxiety at times. I wanted to return to that peaceful place, but I also had this deep knowing that I needed to complete my experience on Earth. I became overly sensitive. I had movies that showed me what people are going through, especially when it comes to healing. I quickly realized that telling people what I saw would only upset them, so I kept what I saw to myself. I would eventually learn to manage what I was seeing by collaborating with my guides. I'm still extremely sensitive, to the point where if I don't keep it in check, my productivity at work and in life suffers. I am easily exhausted and tired. My experience is still unfolding. It's as if I'm seeing bits and pieces of what happened and what I need to know to complete my mission here. I have a strong sense of a mission, but I'm not sure what it is. I did, however, pursue a master's degree in negotiation, conflict resolution, and peace building. Peace building feels very much in line with my mission, but I'm not sure what I should do about it. But I have faith that things will continue to unfold. So I keep going. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell my story. Having a platform to share it on is beneficial and healing. Story number 2. A man's NDE at work allows him to assist his mother in crossing over. Sunday, October 14, 2018. 15:05. In May 2010, I had a heart attack caused by a blood clot that had broken free following an accident in which the bones in my left foot had been crushed after being run over by an errant SUV the month before. I'll never forget the day of the accident because I'd given a homeless woman $20 earlier that day and she tried to give me her Bible, telling me I'd needed more than she would. While in the hospital, I developed a severe case of double pneumonia, which I battled on and off until my condition deteriorated dramatically that November. On Monday, November 29th, I had just arrived at work when I developed a severe coughing fit. I couldn't breathe and recall panicking before passing out, apparently sprawled across my desk. I was instantly surrounded by this vast, loving light. I could hear what sounded like a low, steady buzz, but I was no longer in pain or experiencing any physical sensations. It was like falling through the floor and landing in the palm of God's hand. Though there was no pain, and I had the impression I was on my knees, the light was too bright for me to look at directly. The light was all around me, and there was a courtroom directly in front of me. 4 judges sat on 4 separate tall benches. They were dressed in gray robes with hoods, and I couldn't see their faces, but they were all writing. In front of them was a low courtroom bar, and I knew that if I crossed it, I would never be able to return. I knew the light was God, and when I turned my gaze away from the judges and towards him, everything made sense. I wanted to stay, but had to return. It was communicated to me in pure thought that I was supposed to become a writer, which I found odd and even ludicrous because, in addition to being trained as an engineer, I've always been more of an artist or cartoonist. I also have a degree in physics. I was desperate to stay, so when I heard these voices calling out, "Rudy, Rudy," I kept saying, or trying to say, "Please, Leave me alone. I want to remain. I recall God's final thought, I will heal thee. The next thing I knew, I was regaining consciousness after collapsing so hard on the floor that my forehead began to bleed. My coworkers had come in thinking I was playing dead until I flopped on the floor like dead weight. My coworkers quickly surrounded me and later told me that I just kept saying, wow, over and over, as if wow could even begin to express what I was feeling. I remember being so frustrated, and still am, that I couldn't bring back all of the knowledge I'd acquired. My brain was just so pitifully small. I remember later telling my coworkers about what happened, specifically the part about the light and the message, I will heal thee. I blurted out that I knew then that God had painted his own portrait. People looked at me with both seriousness and suspicion. My boss, on the other hand, was very upset and took a harsher stance, saying, these things don't happen to people like you. Within 18 months, he took early retirement, sold everything he owned, and went off to Concordia Seminary to become a Lutheran minister, but not before transferring me out of his DoD organization. I tell people that it was I who had the religious experience and he who went on to become a minister. I've been processing my experience ever since. I don't have a message for the world, but I will admit to psychic incidents with electronics, my watch is being repaired again, and so on. The most profound thing that happened was when my mother died in January 2017. I was able to tell her to go into the light, even though she was in a coma. At 4:45 a.m., she died in the hospital. I had a feeling she was going to die and had awoken at 4 a.m. on the cot in a room. The nurses, who had a lot of experience with oncology patients dying, thought she'd make it through the weekend, but I knew she wasn't going to make it. She died on my birthday, but it was so peaceful, and I can't help but think that my own experience helped her when the time came. I also believe she hung on for me because she'd gone into a coma the week before due to an unexpected cardiac arrest after being admitted with kidney failure. She was in the early stages of third-stage Alzheimer's, and I can only assume that when she had her own near-death experience the week before, she regained full clarity and wanted to come back for me so that I can make the final decision to let her go. A few things happened after she died, but that's probably for another story.